thank you for joining us tonight. For those who don't know me, I'm Soleil, and I'm the Senior Coordinator of Membership Engagement at BC Soccer. So thanks for coming to the first of a few ITP information sessions. I'll give a little bit of background here. So annually, BC Soccer does a policy and rules review where essentially we go through all of the BC Soccer policies and identify if there are any changes needed to our policies and procedures to make sure that they're serving both us and our membership. And these policies and procedures come into effect at the start of our fiscal year on August 1st. So what we're talking about tonight will come into effect on August 1st, 2024. With a lot of feedback from members and clubs since beginning our partnership with ITP Sports, we identified the discipline complaints and appeal policy and procedures as an area of focus for updates this year. So we thought that it was important to host these information sessions to keep you guys up to date as we've gone through some significant policy changes this year. With that being said, I know you're not here to listen to me talk, so I will pass it off to Samantha Heron, the Chief Complaints Officer at ITP Sports, to go into further details about some of the upcoming changes in this area. And when I hit mute all, I did mute you, Samantha, just so you know.
It's okay. Thanks, Soleil. And given the title of Chief Complaints Officer, I'm sure that not all of you want to hear me talk as well. But I know some familiar faces in the room. For those that don't know me, my name is Samantha. I also go by Sam. I use the pronouns she and her. I am, as many people are not aware of, actually on the traditional territories of the Algonquin-speaking peoples, which is also known as Saanich on Lower Vancouver Island. And so my work with BC Soccer is both to support BC Soccer as an organization in their complaint management and in administering the complaint discipline and appeals procedures. At the same time, I also do individual complaint management with BC Soccer as well as our other sport organizations. So I'm very intimate with the nuances of navigating the spectrum of complaints that we process, but then also spend a lot of time going, okay, what is the appropriate policy and procedure for the organization? You may feel sick of hearing about policy and procedure. I know that it's not the light reading that anybody ever wants to do. However, it's hugely important to understand that the policy from my perspective is viewed as our bread and butter. It's fundamental to every action we take, because in any complaints process, the policy or complaint and discipline procedures, similar to any that you may administer, is absolutely fundamental for guiding the steps we can and cannot take in any specific complaint proceeding. So tonight, I'm here to speak to you with some of the rationale behind the changes, but as well in as plain language as I can, what some of the key changes are. I understand or expect that you do have a base familiarity with the BC Soccer complaint and discipline procedures, so I won't go in depth onto what the sort of existing fundamentals are of each piece. What feels quite crucial for me to do in this session is to highlight, what are some of the key changes. So I will share my screen in a moment. As we navigate through it, if you put questions in the chat, I won't be able to see it until the end. What I would encourage is, if you have a question that is specific to what I am speaking about as we go through, unmute yourself and ask, because likely if you've got a question, somebody else does. If it's not specific to the point or slide that I'm on, I'd strongly encourage that you place it in the chat and we'll address it at the end, just to support the flow of this evening. I do note that this is a recorded session that will be shared to other discipline chairs or other members. One of the things that I always say is, if somebody wants to ask a question around a complaint proceeding you may have been a part of, given that we want to respect the privacy of any complaint proceedings, please speak as much as possible in general terms and refrain from sharing identifying information. Like I said, this is a recorded and will be shared session this evening. So without further ado, I will share my screen. I will begin. And like I said, I'm not able to see your questions this evening, so please unmute yourselves if you have one. Otherwise, place it in the chat until the end. So as Soleil mentioned, we're here this evening to talk about the 2024 update to the BC Soccer specific discipline complaint and appeals procedures. I see this as the suite of policies that support the judicial bodies of BC Soccer. I also see this as a resource for registered organizations or member organizations to adopt or to use the parts that are relevant to you when navigating your own complaint proceeding. So one of the first spaces that I'll start with is, well, it's not hugely different. In the past, the complaint discipline and appeals procedure, so not the policy, but the procedure, this is the step that you can expect the ITP to navigate through, has actually been broken out into 5 separate procedures. Why this is useful is it means that if I'm somebody involved with a field of play violation, which was called formerly Tier 3, I don't need to parse through the major infraction procedure, the member organization violation of governing documents procedure. I could just focus on the procedure that's relevant to my complaint. What is applicable to all complaints is the triage procedures. Triage is where we typically spend most of our time as case managers. That's every step taken between a complaint being filed and a decision being made on if that complaint is admissible or not, and if admissible, what direction it's going down. From there, for any complaint that is admissible, it's going to go to one of 3 spaces. And we'll go more in depth on the key changes to each of them. One of them will be, and trust me, these are long titles, but it was the most comprehensive we could come up with for what they are about. The first one will be the FIFA laws of the game or field of play violations, complaint and discipline procedures. This is typically what you may be addressing when you're thinking of any sort of discipline process that results in something that occurred during a game or a match. The next one is a member organization violation of BCSA governing documents. So we'll go into more of the specifics of this, but this one is something that could be a code of conduct violation, it could be a policy violation, or some sort of lack of adherence to the BC Soccer governing documents. The last one, which is typically our most egregious type of complaint, is considered a major infraction and violation of the BC Universal Code of Conduct. That's the UCC for short. This is something that is related to, for example, physical maltreatment, sexual maltreatment, abuse, harassment, discrimination. And then not involved in those 3 complaint pillars, but also hugely important, is the appeals procedure. And so appeals are available to all 3 of these different types of complaint with some minor nuance based on the type of appeal. What you'll notice in the updated discipline complaints and appeals policy is just some updated language on the judicial body. So to be clear, the ITP plays a role with the judicial body, largely around the triage and management of those governing document complaints. The independent discipline chair, which if you're familiar with Mr. Dave Jones, is his position. The independent discipline chair is responsible for chairing or overseeing all of those field of play violations, but he also has some specific functions that are in alignment with the BC Soccer bylaws and support some of the nuances that we see in a complaint process that are separate from these 3 major pillars of complaints and the appeals process. In addition to the ITP and the independent discipline chair, any appointed discipline panel So that may be if you're on BC Soccer discipline panels, you're doing this in a volunteer role, which is hugely appreciated for those field of play violations. But for the governing document violations or those major infractions, this is where we're bringing in an external arbitrator or external dispute resolution specialist who is able to navigate through those more complex complaints that typically encompass a larger or more drawn out judicial proceeding. So to start, the key overall changes to the policy and where I'm going to spend probably a lot of time this evening is around the jurisdiction of BC Soccer Association. And what I mean by jurisdiction is what matters will BC Soccer as an organization take on? And when I say BC Soccer, I mean the ITP is a service provider to BC Soccer. What matters will be referred to a member organization, the member organization being the league and or district. And of course, what matters may be escalated to Canada Soccer. So the jurisdiction of complaint is where we spend a lot of time when determining the admissibility of a complaint. When a matter comes in, does it meet the criteria to fall under the BC Soccer scope, or should it be referred to an appropriate organization, member organization, or external body? When I say external body, I may mean Canada Soccer, or I may mean, for example, a criminal or civil proceeding. So this is a key change, and this is the change that will likely have the most impact on you as a discipline chair or person involved in a discipline proceeding at the league and district level. One of the other pieces that's hugely important is an update to the privacy policy and to the information that we can ask for. Many of you, rightly so, have asked the question, well, how do we navigate sharing information when it's requested by the ITP on behalf of BC Soccer against respecting the confidentiality of the information that you have from your members or participants. And so we've made sure that this proceeding or this process is accurately accounted for in the BC Soccer privacy policy in regard to how information is shared. And this will allow us to also not restrict registered organizations from being involved or being notified appropriately of a complaint proceeding to minimize those feelings of being in the dark due to a confidentiality concern or consideration, of course, where appropriate. The other piece here with the jurisdiction change is you're actually going to see a limited scope of what type of complaints will be addressed by BC Soccer. Very important for me to emphasize is all cases of maltreatment. Those are those BC Universal Code of Conduct violations will remain under the jurisdiction of BC Soccer, and BC Soccer will be available via the ITP to address those egregious cases that are involving, as mentioned, maltreatment. What you will see coming at member organizations is when we're getting complaints around a code of conduct violation at the club level or a dispute between, let's use an example, board members at a club level. There'll be an increased requirement or ability for the registered organizations and or that club to first address that matter or identify any sort of capacity concerns in addressing the matter. And we'll touch more on referrals later this evening. In addition, we'll have a better and more clearly defined roles and functions of the ITP discipline chair and appeals chair, just to help build understanding of the process and to clarify, well, what does it mean when the ITP is a neutral administrator versus a discipline panel who's actually a decision maker in a matter, and how can we help people understand that through policy, or how can we use the policy as a tool to understand the role and function of the different members that make up the judicial body. One of the other fundamental pieces that I will touch on this evening as a key change, in addition to the jurisdiction one, is an added or increased clarity on the criteria and requirements for submitting a formal complaint. And so what is meant by that is there's, on reflection of the type of complaints that have come in, I would say low understanding or awareness that entering a formal complaint process, especially that governing document violation or maltreatment type case, is quite a, quasi-judicial process. What that means is that discipline panel, that arbitrator at the end of the day is making a decision on what's called a balance of probabilities of did this violation occur or did it not? There is an onus on the complainant to provide enough information as possible. And there's always, trust me, there's a spectrum to this and a nuance to it. But to provide as much information, witness information, or materials to support their complaint or position. I think it's very fair to say that this wasn't clear in the previous complaint discipline and appeals process. And what needs to be understood is that the ITP can't be an advocate for either party. Therefore, we can't support a party in formulating their complaint or gathering the information for it, with exception of cases that are moved to an investigation. And so therefore, we want to make clear, well, what is the criteria needed to engage in a formal complaint process, and also educate individuals on the decision to engage in a formal complaint process versus explore other types of alternative dispute resolution ahead of or alongside going through what can be definitely a challenging proceeding. One of the things that we felt was important based on feedback from member organizations, especially member organizations that work with youth, is an increased ability to involve, notify, engage registered organizations in the complaint proceeding, especially for those maltreatment violations. When you're thinking of a youth-related case where, for example, you've got a youth respondent who's made a really big mistake, right? The ability for the club to be engaged in the outcome or speak to or participate in the process supports a better resolution and supports a better understanding by the clubs or the registered organization in what's actually the outcome here, or how can I best support the participants in my jurisdiction or community to reintegrate after going through a complaint process. So what we've done is remove some of those confidentiality constraints that were holding us back from communicating with the registered organization in the past. And where appropriate, not for every case, but where appropriate, we will engage or be in a position to engage the registered organizations. I won't touch on it too much, but it's available is an expanded list of sanctions. I know it's hugely important given, for example, the treatment towards youth officials in the province and in the sport to make sure that our cases involving youth that are impacted by a conflict allow us to have some nuance to the sanctions. And then the last piece I'll touch on here is increased or more defined language on presumptive sanctions or provisional measures. So for example, if somebody is navigating a criminal proceeding or at risk of being convicted, or if we're considering that there is a significant risk to the individual, the parties involved, or the direct sport community, we've got some increased language for how we can support a provisional measures or stand behind a provisional measure. And so following the complaint and discipline policy, we're now going to get into the specifics of the different procedures that I've outlined this evening. Before I do that, I'll pause. Any questions relevant to the material that we have just covered? And if you have one, please take off your mic and ask the question. I see a hand up from Albert Stewart. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm just curious, is there going to be any changes to the current judicial codes and guidelines that we use in discipline? Is any of that going to be updated in the future? Because I think the one that I have is now a few years old. And I wasn't sure who would be updating that, whether it was BC Soccer or whether it was the ITP. Thank you.
Yes. So good question, Albert. We're likely talking about, I'm likely speaking at you about the same policy that you're referencing. Your previous judicial code is now updated to be titled the Discipline Complaint and Appeals Procedure. So yes, this is an update to that. And then one other added piece here is the development of this is done in collaboration between BC Soccer and ITP. So Soleil and Gabriel have been very patient over the last couple of months in navigating what the changes need to be against what is appropriate for the BC Soccer context, and then what are the norms and best practices across the Canadian sport landscape.
Will we be able to download that from somewhere on the BC Soccer website?
Yeah, so this will be posted under the BC Soccer governing documents or policy landing page, so it should always be up and available for any participant to access.
And
so-
just to quickly,
go ahead.
sorry, I just will quickly speak to that as well. We will be uploading the new ones in the coming week or so. And with that, it will come into effect on August 1st, but you will be able to review it in advance, hopefully by the end of this week.
Thanks, Soleil. So on that note, what you will see uploaded are these updated triage procedures alongside all of the other ones. As mentioned earlier, the triage procedure will include an updated criteria on how complaints are determined, or sorry, on which pathway complaints are determined to go down based on the criteria as the complaint includes the allegations or the information. In addition to this, the triage procedure will also include information on, well, what's required in regard to a complainant's participation in the complaint process. And what that means is sometimes we will have people submit a complaint and then we never hear from them again. And therefore they're not in a position to accurately represent to their complaint or for us to see it through. In addition, which is absolutely okay for people to go, hey, I'm not sure what to do. I've witnessed something that I'm uncomfortable about, so I'm going to report it. Yet they don't always intend to go through with a formal complaint proceeding. And so one of the initial steps that we'll take at any time a complaint is filed is send through a one-pager or a couple of pages on, well, what does it mean to engage in a formal complaint process, and confirm that that reporter or that complainant wants to proceed. That individual says, I don't want to proceed, but I'm not sure where else to go. We will, of course, always support them with alternative courses of action, and often spend a lot of time educating people, well, what are other types of dispute resolution that are available ahead of going through a formal complaint proceeding. What's hugely important when you're talking to your participants or your membership is to explain that due to the judicial nature of a complaint proceeding, there is a responsibility for the complainant, and trust me, I know how challenging it can be after somebody has gone through a threatening or challenging experience. There is a responsibility of the complainant to provide a comprehensive complaint and to represent their complaint to the best of their ability. That also supports them in having likely the most desirable outcome from their position. And so we will have additional education or materials shared to the BC Soccer membership. But wherever possible, so for example, if somebody comes to you and says, hey, I witnessed this, I'm not sure what to do, make sure that you direct them to the available resources, encourage people to write things down, gather witness statements, and really consider what the possible pathways are for them in order to navigate a dispute or a conflict that they're experiencing. And so on that note, my background, a big reason why I'm in this work is because I have a lot of experience with alternative dispute resolution. For the majority of matters that we see, alternative dispute resolution could really be a positive outcome. And so that's any sort of mediated or negotiated outcome. This can be a really great resolution for a matter, because it's important to note that the only time that somebody is getting suspended for a significant period of time or expelled permanently from an organization is because something egregious has occurred. And when I mean egregious, I mean very egregious. For those conflicts that just seem to kind of bubble and fester, understanding that likely people are going to have to remain in the same environment together, and therefore focusing outcomes on a resolution where people can exist in the environment together in a positive and healthy way is hugely important. And so we will speak more and spend more time proposing this to complainants or parties ahead of navigating through the complaint proceeding. If you've got matters coming up in front of you where people are bringing conflicts across your desk, I'd strongly encourage you to try and resolve the matter with alternative dispute resolution, because if you're not successful, nothing prevents you from proceeding through a formal complaint process, but it can be a really good tool and resource for a more positive outcome. And it also gives you more ability and agency to determine the outcome. And as mentioned earlier, what you'll see here is clearly defined guidelines that allow us to make a more clear assessment on when and why a provisional suspension or interim measure is required for any complaint process. Generally, the rule of thumb, as mentioned earlier, and if you're a decision maker in your organization, I'd encourage you to use the same lens, is: do we need to put an interim measure, which doesn't necessarily mean suspension? It may mean we just have the parties remain separated, or we always ensure there is a trusted adult in the environment, or we provisionally suspend somebody and remove them from the environment. But if we are doing that, it's because we're identifying that one or both individuals are at risk to each other. They're at risk to themselves for further immediate physical or psychological harm, and or they're at immediate physical or psychological risk to their sport community. Those are kind of the parameters that we will look at a provisional suspension or interim measure for. We don't want to do it because we think the person has done something really bad and we're angry at them. We don't want to do it to punish somebody in advance. It's really your strongest risk management tool to ensure that no further harm happens until that matter comes to resolution. So our first pillar of complaint management, it was called formally Tier 3. So these are those field of play related violations or FIFA laws of the game violations. And these complaints are overseen by the independent discipline chair. And the updated procedure clarifies that now, the procedure and what BC Soccer will address is any field of play violations specific to BCSPL activities or matches and competitions directly operated by BC Soccer. What this means is that all field of play violations that fall outside of this scope are to be addressed by the league or district in which that violation occurred. What we've also done here is updated the hearing format to allow for an expedited steps where appropriate, to allow the independent discipline chair to run a written hearing versus an oral one, because it can get very challenging to navigate scheduling for that oral one. However, there's always the option where it's necessary for the complaint. And a more clear procedure on those documentary and oral hearings to support an ideally faster resolution on these field of play violations. Next up, which is where I think we probably have the largest amount of change. So these are formally Tier 2 complaints. These are those code of conduct violations that aren't maltreatment. These are violations of the BC Soccer governing documents. These complaints, the updated scope is only for leagues and or districts. So this is where A league or district has violated, like I said, code of conduct or a governing documents. The major change here is this used to be applicable to all registered organizations, and now the scope is reduced to the member organizations. However, there is an option for referral of complaint due to, for example, a conflict of interest by the league district or a lack of capacity to address the matter, especially based on the complexity of it. However, that member organization will have to provide the rationale for why the matter should be escalated to BC Soccer. One of the pieces here that we've had an experience or reflection on is many of these complaints would list years and years of conflict or have many materials included as part of it that are quite outside the scope of what the specific complaint is. And so we've seen these complaints, I would say, expand unnecessarily in the past. And so we want to ensure that people have access to an expedited procedure and a procedure that allows us to get to the heart of the matter as soon as possible, recognizing that there's often a different knowledge or a different understanding of what needs to be included in a complaint process compared to, for example, somebody's legal counsel who's very familiar with this type of proceeding. So what you'll note in the procedure is some restrictions on the type of information and the length of information that can be submitted, a preference that these matters go to what is called a summary hearing. So that's going to be a written hearing where there's a certain criteria or set of information to be provided by both parties for that dispute resolution specialist, who is typically an arbitrator, to address. However, there will be an option for what's called an expanded hearing. This is where you're going to see some interviews that are done orally by a teleconference, such as Microsoft Teams or Zoom, or where you may see witnesses interviewed. Based on the complaint, it will be at the discretion of that dispute resolution specialist to determine, okay, are we doing a summary proceeding or are we doing an expanded one? And then lastly, in regard to our procedure pieces here, are formally Tier 1, so your major infraction and BC Universal Code of Conduct violations. What we've noted is the field of play violations existed and were in place long before Safe Sport existed. What that meant is that you had parallel language for what would be considered maltreatment, and I'm going to say in brackets, kind of, and what would be considered a field of play violations to be addressed in accordance, for example, with the BC Soccer sanctioning tables. And so there was a lot of complaints being submitted that could be reasonably and appropriately addressed by that field of play violation procedure that, due to some policy constraints, would say are inappropriately escalated to the Tier 1 process. And so what we've done for the field of play violations or for the maltreatment violations have listed a set of criteria that, if it can be reasonably addressed at the field of play violation level, then we will keep it there. However, there's always the ability for that discipline chair to escalate if they see appropriate. As mentioned earlier, got an increased ability for participation by the registered organizations, especially in those youth cases, and then an increased ability to expedite youth cases. I know that taking a couple of months to come to resolution can feel like a lifetime, and that's especially so for youth players. And so wherever possible, we want to make sure that we address those. However, I will note that procedural fairness and a natural justice will always be the priority for navigating any complaint process. And then wherever possible, we will expedite the timelines. However, we won't compromise on the first two principles to ensure that we come to a fair and appropriate resolution, especially for these very significant and challenging matters that are a maltreatment violation. And so No major changes at the appeals section. Most of the steps remain the same. The only piece that's important to highlight is there will be a requirement for the ITP to suggest that the parties engage in alternative dispute resolution. And the purpose of this is to draw the parties' attention to, okay, we could try and resolve this ahead of going through what is in fact another hearing. And of course, as mentioned earlier, if they're unsuccessful, they can continue with their appeal. But we at least want to build some awareness around this to provide that option to participants, of course, only where appropriate. And so we're getting closer to the end. We're going to get close to a question soon, but there's two additional slides I want to go through. One of them is why change. And as I've gone through some of the points tonight, I think that I've covered some of the rationale, but what's really important is I've had significant engagement from BC Soccer, the board, on feedback about the process. We, as the ITP, have learned a lot going through hundreds and hundreds of complaints over the last couple of years. And we've had the opportunity to receive feedback from member organizations. And I hugely appreciate the approach and the fairness that many member organizations have showed up with when providing feedback on the process. What I'm looking forward to is an increased ability to liaise with discipline chairs and engage, individuals such as yourselves in the complaint process, and allow for more of that notification where it's helpful. I'm really hopeful that we can increase the understanding of what it means to engage in a complaint process, especially for those maltreatment and those governing violations. It's really important that people feel informed ahead of and during the proceeding. And I know that it's not the most exciting thing to talk about it on a Tuesday night, but I would rather talk about it now versus when somebody is feeling threatened or hurt by a conflict and then having to come up to speed with what this process is. And then, of course, BC Soccer and the ITP want to ensure that the right matters are heard by BC Soccer and that the member organizations are empowered to resolve conflict and resolve dispute where appropriate, instead of always having to be engaged with an ITP process. We, of course, have had a significant number of cases involve youth. I'm very, very appreciative of the discipline panels that we work with and their approach to resolution that avoids some punitive sanctions on youth or that has an appropriate sensitivity to youth that have experienced harm. And so we will continue to include pieces in the policy that allow us to have an increased sensitivity to it. And ensure that what can be an intimidating process for anyone, let alone a minor, has the right steps in front of it. And then lastly, clarity on jurisdiction will really support member organizations in working with your participants on, okay, when is it appropriate to escalate to the ITP or BC Soccer, and when is it something that we're going to address, quote unquote, in-house, and ensure that people aren't, being inappropriately escalated and then having their matter referred back, because that delays the timelines in which somebody can have their matter heard or brought to a resolution. And then, ultimately, especially, for example, for that new parent coming into your organization or that new player is building an understanding of, well, where do I go to formally report and where do I go to informally have a conversation about what's the best thing to do? And so what we hope to do, and I'll touch on this on my last slide, is build a knowledge or build a shared understanding between the discipline chairs, the member organizations, and BC Soccer on how to navigate conflicts as they come up in the soccer environment. So what you'll see here, and what I hope is clear in further education, so you'll note some dates on the bottom here, is support in understanding when do I escalate or when do I report the matter in front of me to the ITP, or when should I assume that it's actually within R. When I say R, it's you as a member organization's jurisdiction. Of course, when in doubt, I always will say report or reach out to have a conversation. The most important thing you can do in a complaint process or when somebody reports a complaint to you is to inform people of their options. Oftentimes, people's first response is, there's a conflict in front of me, call the ITP. My suggested approach is make sure that the individual knows how to report to the ITP and knows that it's an option for them, but also explain what the other options are and where you have the capacity to offer support for resolving the matter. Because as mentioned earlier, almost all of the time, that negotiated or mediated outcome is better than having a sanction issued, case dependent. What we'll also see here is, of course, where there is a lack of capacity, a conflict of interest, a concern in managing the complaint, there will be the opportunity for referral. There will be some cost consideration to this. So BC Soccer does participate in confirming, yes, we're comfortable having this matter referred, or we don't think it's appropriate for it to be referred up. And member organizations should be aware that there will be a cost sharing aspect or element of this, case dependent. And so, of course, where it's an egregious matter or where it's appropriate for BC Soccer to hear it, that's absolutely something that will be accepted. And where a member organization is just simply not in a position to hear it, there may be a cost sharing aspect of it. One of the pieces that we want to highlight is, trust me, I find navigating a complaint process challenging. I know that many of you are volunteers, or this is only one tiny component of your entire role. And so we do want to offer education and building a shared understanding on how to administer a discipline process. You won't have to listen to me for all of it. We're hoping to bring in some of the other panels that have worked on cases and can see some key themes coming up, who will be able to go, yeah, this is what you should be considering when doing your discipline process, or this is what you may want to stop doing, or ensure you have in place. In order to, as best as possible, navigate your own matters with your own agency.